hell is that? Oh my God, oh my God.
After several years of debunking Bigfoot stories, David Paulides has just found new DNA evidence of Bigfoot, and the results are life-changing. What this DNA says about the Sasquatch's existence is the most convincing proof in history, and Paulides is finally revealing what he found. Paulides had been building this case since July 2020. He had spent 6 years collecting physical evidence across North America to a standard of rigor that addressed every objection before it was raised. 347 hair samples, 89 scat samples, 234 footprint casts, 47 handprint casts, 12 blood samples, a nesting site, tooth fragments, a burial, all of it pointing at the same conclusion, all of it processed by independent laboratories, all of it returning the same profile. And yet, none of it had produced a specific number. The March 2026 sample produced the number. And the number was the thing Paulides had suspected for 14 months, had built the entire corroboration chain to support, and had not shared publicly because a number of that precision required the kind of documentation that didn't exist yet. It exists now. Before this account reaches what the March results showed, and what Paulides did with them, and why a former law enforcement officer turned missing persons investigator became the person who finally produced the result that 6 years of institutional science had failed to produce. Before any of that, 3 things need to be kept in mind. The first is what the evidence record looked like before March 2026, and why it remained incomplete despite everything it contained. The second is why the European laboratory's expanded reference database changed what the result meant. The third is why Paulides sat with a number for 4 days before he told anyone what it was, and what that number means for 14 people whose families have been waiting for answers for years. The DNA is new. Paulides was in the North Cascades investigating a disappearance, the kind of case that had become the central thread of his work over the preceding decade. A hiker was reported missing 11 days earlier, experienced, familiar with the terrain. Last contact from a location approximately 9 miles from the nearest trailhead, in a drainage that appeared in Paulides' evidence records from 3 prior sample collection visits. The official search had thoroughly covered the accessible terrain. It had found nothing. Paulides arrived at the last known location not as part of the official search effort, but because the drainage was one he knew, because the pattern matched, and because he had learned years ago that the thing worth looking for at a site like this was not the hiker. The hair was snagged on the bark of a Douglas fir at a height of 8.5 feet, not 6 feet, not 7 feet. 8.5 feet, which Paulides measured twice with a collapsible pole he carried specifically for documentation purposes, because heights mattered, and estimates were not documentation. The height mattered for one reason: no animal whose presence in the North Cascades was cataloged, confirmed, and unremarkable left hair at that elevation in that context. Bears mark trees. Bears leave hair on bark. Bears do not leave hair at 8.5 feet in a clean snag pattern on a smooth section of trunk, with no vertical scoring, no claw marks, and no bark compression from body weight above the sample point. The hair was fresh, not degraded from weather exposure, not bleached from UV, not matted from rain and drying. Fresh contact. Within days at most, the hiker had been reported missing 11 days ago. The hair on this tree was not 11 days old. Paulides photographed the site, documented the GPS coordinates, and collected the hair using sterile tweezers and sealed evidence bags he carried as standard field equipment. The chain of custody log he started at that moment was the same protocol he had maintained for 20 years in law enforcement, not because he anticipated litigation, because documentation was the difference between evidence and story, and he had spent long enough in both domains to know which one he was trying to produce. He divided the sample. One portion went to a wildlife DNA laboratory in Texas whose work he had reviewed and trusted. One portion went to a Canadian genomics facility that specialized in non-standard biological material from remote collection environments. One portion went to a laboratory in Europe with a specific focus on primate genetics and a reference database that covered material the North American facilities did not. He sent each portion with identical chain of custody documentation and identical descriptions. Unclassified primate hair, remote field collection, northern Washington state. He did not tell any of them what he thought it was. He had been waiting for results of this kind for years. That didn't make the waiting easier. It made it harder. All three had flagged the material in the same way. Primate characteristics confirmed. Keratin structure consistent with great apes. Medullary patterns and protein markers that placed the sample inside the primate family. And then the same wall, the same conclusion, the same language that laboratories use when a sample defeats their reference database. No match to any known species. He had confirmed two things. The first was that the sample was not contaminated. The second was that three independent facilities working from the same material had arrived at the same place. An organism was leaving hair on trees in the North Cascades that no laboratory anywhere had a category for. He did not call anyone for 4 days. But to understand why this particular sample was different from everything that had come before it, why Paulides sat with these results longer than he had sat with any result in 6 years of fieldwork, you need to understand what he had already built, because this wasn't where the story started, this was where it ended. One more thing before this continues. During the research for this case, I found additional material, files, footage, and documentation that never made it into the public record. Some of it was taken down, and some was never uploaded at all. What I found is in the description for this video. The systematic collection began in July 2020 using a similar hair sample from the same general region. That first sample had returned results indicating it was primate material, keratin structure consistent with great apes, and medullary patterns that didn't match any known species in laboratory databases. Enough to confirm something unknown was leaving biological material in the Pacific Northwest, but not enough to answer what it was. He spent the following 2 years building what he would later describe as an irrefutable case, not a claim. A case in the legal and evidentiary sense, the kind that required not one sample, but a systematic body of evidence collected to a standard that addressed every objection before it was raised. He knew what the objections would be because he had watched them deployed against every other researcher who had tried to build this argument without the documentation to support it. By the end of 2022, Paulides had collected 47 additional hair samples from locations across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, and the Rocky Mountains. Every sample is sent to at least 2 independent facilities. Every result is consistent with the original finding. The samples were not from one location, they were not from a single drainage, a single forest, or a single elevation band. They were from a geographic range that, when mapped, formed a distribution pattern. Patterns were the thing Paulides trusted. A single data point was an anomaly. 48 data points, spread across a consistent range and all returning the same genetic profile, were a population. The mainstream objection, when he eventually shared preliminary findings, was contamination, the same objection raised against every unorthodox biological finding in this field for decades. Paulides had built his method specifically to address it at every stage, from collection through laboratory processing. He had the chain of custody documentation to demonstrate that. A geneticist who reviewed the DNA analysis, independent of any institutional affiliation, confirmed that the divergence calculations were methodologically sound and that the profile was genuinely outside the reference databases she had access to. She had 2 questions after reviewing the material. Paulides answered them both. She had no third question. The scat samples came in March 2021, and they changed the profile of the evidence in a way that the hair samples alone could not. Paulides had been investigating a cluster of disappearances near Mount Rainier when he found fecal material at a site he was documenting for his missing persons work. The samples were large, approximately 6 inches in diameter and 14 inches long. The gut bacteria present included species found in gorillas and chimpanzees, not as trace contamination, but as the dominant microbial community in combinations and concentrations characteristic of great ape digestive systems. The bone fragments in the scat showed tooth marks with crushing force consistent with a large primate, but the bite geometry was wrong for bears, flatter molars, and different bite mechanics. The nesting site in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest was found in June 2022, shifting the evidence from biological to behavioral. The site was sheltered beneath an overhanging rock formation approximately 11 miles from the nearest maintained trail in terrain that required 2 days of difficult travel to access. Paulides found it while following a line of footprints in soft ground, impressions he had documented and cast dozens of times over the preceding 2 years, 15 to 17 inches in length. Consistent depth profile, clear toe impressions, and the mid-tarsal break in the arch. He followed the prints to the rock formation and understood immediately what he was looking at. The bedding was constructed and not accumulated randomly from fallen material. Branches had been bent and positioned deliberately, woven in a pattern that created structure, rather than simply depositing material in a location. Paulides collected fiber samples from the bedding. They contained the same hair type he had been documenting for 2 years. He found the handprints in mud near the water source at the site's edge. 5 impressions, each showing 5 fingers, an opposable thumb, and dermal ridge detail in the cleaner sections. He cast them all. The dimensions, approximately 12 to 14 inches from wrist to fingertip, placed them beyond the range of any known North American primate. The forensic specialists who reviewed the casts confirmed primate hand architecture, scaled up with the functional proportions of a hand adapted for grip and manipulation rather than locomotion. The bone fragments near the site were what added the final layer. Partially consumed animal remains, showing deliberate processing marks, scraping patterns on the bone surface, cutting geometry not consistent with tooth marks or scavenging by smaller animals. The marks were the kind left by a sharp-edged implement used with controlled force to separate meat from bone, the signature of tool use. Paulides sat with those bones for a long time. He had confirmed hair, scat, prints, handprints, nesting construction, and now tool marks. The evidence had grown from a single anomalous sample to a behavioral profile, not just an organism with habits. The blood samples arrived in 2023 through a witness account that Paulides had not expected to find corroborated. A researcher reported finding the aftermath of a confrontation between an unknown large animal and a black bear. Paulides traveled to the site. Blood on tree bark and exposed rock, 2 sources, one matching bear genetics, one that did not. The non-bear blood returned the same profile that had been returning from every other sample in Paulides' collection for 3 years. Primate markers, no known species match, consistent with the hair samples, with the scat-derived cellular material, and with the full body of evidence accumulated since July 2020. He sent a portion of the blood to a specialized laboratory in Germany for its advanced genomic sequencing capabilities and expanded reference database. The German lab ran automatic cross-reference against the ancient DNA archive as part of its standard processing protocol, the broadest possible comparison against the widest available reference material. It returned a result that Paulides read twice before he called anyone, a specific number, a percentage. He did not share it publicly. He held it for 14 months while he built the corroboration chain that could support it. That number needed the March 2026 sample to confirm it. The March 2026 sample confirmed it. By 2024, the physical evidence collection stood at 347 hair samples, 89 scat samples, 234 footprint casts, 47 handprint casts, 12 blood samples. Every item collected under the same chain of custody protocols, all results consistent with the same genetic profile. The tooth fragments in April 2025 were the discovery Paulides had not been looking for. A deer carcass in the Olympic National Forest, crushing geometry wrong for mountain lion, wrong for bear, wrong for coyote. 2 molars embedded in bone, dimensions significantly larger than human teeth, enamel composition consistent with a primate consuming both plant material and meat over an extended period. Cusp geometry found in great apes, not in bears, not in any canid, not in any other North American mammal. Then the territorial markers in July 2025. 34 trees in a 12-square-mile area of the Cascades show identical bark stripping patterns at heights between 7 and 9 feet. Chemical analysis returned pheromone-adjacent secretions consistent with scent-marking behavior in great apes, a boundary marker that persisted in the environment long enough to be read by other individuals passing through. 34 trees across 12 square miles. Not foraging, not storm damage. A system. An organism that knew where its range ended and maintained that boundary deliberately. The burial site was found in January 2026, and it changed the weight of everything that had preceded it. Paulides had been following up on a trail camera placement from the previous summer in a remote section of the North Cascades when he found the stones. His initial reading was natural accumulation. He understood within minutes that it was not. The stones had been placed, a covering pattern over an elongated depression in the ground, the kind that documented intentional burial produces in archaeological contexts, which Paulides had studied, specifically because his missing persons research had led him through enough forensic archaeology consultation to recognize deliberate site modification when he encountered it. He cleared the stones and found the remains beneath, a femur measuring 26 inches in length, vertebrae showing the specific adaptation of sustained bipedal locomotion, the curvature, the density, the structural reinforcement that distinguishes animals that habitually walk upright from those that don't. A partial skull with morphology between modern human anatomy and archaic hominid features. Not fully either, not fully neither. Intermediate, exactly where the blood result from Germany had suggested the genetic profile would sit. Carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 340 years old, not prehistoric, present in those mountains while the first European settlements were establishing themselves along the North American coast, the same period whose written historical record contained accounts of large, unknown beings in the wilderness that had been dismissed for centuries as folklore. The stones were not folklore. The femur was not folklore. The burial arrangement, deliberate covering of a dead individual, a practice that archaeologists treated as one of the defining markers of advanced cognition, was not folklore. Paulides sat with the site for a long time before he began documentation. He had been building a case for 6 years. He understood from the first moment he saw those stones what the site was, and he understood what it meant in the context of everything that had preceded it. The hair from the Douglas fir in July 2020, the scat near Mount Rainier, the handprints in the Gifford Pinchot mud, the blood that matched across 3 laboratories, the tooth fragments from the deer carcass, the territorial markers across 34 trees, the footage of 3 individuals, adult male, adult female, juvenile, near a stream in British Columbia captured on trail cameras in late 2025. And now a deliberate burial, 340 years old, in a remote section of the mountains where all of it had been happening. He had confirmed what it was. He had confirmed what it understood itself to be. What he had not yet confirmed, what the March 2026 sample was going to settle once and for all, was exactly how close it was. That was the number he had been carrying for 14 months. That was the number the March sample was going to confirm or dismantle. The trail camera footage came in late 2025. Paulides had located an active population area in a remote section of British Columbia, positioned surveillance equipment at established movement corridors, and waited. The cameras returned footage of 3 individuals over several months, an adult male approximately 8.5 feet tall, an adult female approximately 7 feet tall, and a juvenile approximately 4.5 feet tall. Family group dynamics, coordinated movement patterns, documentation with timestamps, GPS coordinates, chain of custody, covering every piece of storage media. That footage confirmed presence. It confirmed behavior. It confirmed family structure. It did not confirm what Paulides had suspected since the blood results from Germany, the result he had held privately for 14 months while he built the corroboration chain around it. The result of the March 2026 sample was going to either confirm or dismantle. The 3 laboratories returned their analyses within 3 weeks of receiving the March sample. Paulides read each report completely before moving to the next. He had read enough laboratory reports over 6 years to know what a contamination flag looked like and what it didn't look like. What these reports showed was not contamination. The European facility had run the sample through an expanded reference database that included ancient DNA archives, the same automatic cross-reference protocol that had flagged the blood sample 14 months earlier. The protocol ran every sequence against every database it had access to. It did not ask whether the person running the analysis was prepared to receive the result. It reported what it found. The result was the same. And then, on the 4th day, Paulides made the call. The 96% figure is what changed everything, not 98%, which was where chimpanzees registered on the same scale, not 94%. 96% genetic similarity to modern humans, closer to human than any other known living primate on Earth, distinct enough to represent a separate lineage, positioned on the genetic spectrum in a place that no currently cataloged organism occupies. The German laboratory had first returned this figure 14 months earlier from the blood samples. Paulides had read it twice, put it down, and not shared it with anyone, not because he doubted it, because a number of that precision, if released without a corroboration chain capable of withstanding serious scientific challenge, would be dismissed before the evidence that supported it could be heard. He had watched that happen to other researchers in this field. He was not going to let it happen to 6 years of documented physical evidence. The March 2026 hair sample sent to the European facility had been run through the same expanded reference database. The European lab's protocol, like the German laboratories, ran automatic cross-reference against the ancient DNA archive as part of standard processing. It did not ask whether the person who submitted the material was prepared to receive the result. It reported what it found. What it found was the same number, 96%. Twice confirmed from 2 independent sample types, blood and hair, processed by 2 separate facilities in 2 different countries with no knowledge of each other's results. The number was not a single laboratory's finding, it was a replicated result. The analysis pointed to a surviving population of archaic hominids, a lineage that had shared an ancestor with modern humans, diverged at a specific point in deep prehistory, and continued developing independently, not towards civilization and agriculture and the institutional infrastructure of the modern world, into forests, into remote drainage, into the specific terrain that had been producing Paulides' evidence samples for 6 years and producing missing persons cases for considerably longer. The 15,000-year divergence timeline placed the separation before agriculture reached North America, before any permanent human settlement on the continent. A population isolated long enough to accumulate adaptations specific to wilderness survival, but genetically close enough to modern humans that when the laboratory returned the similarity figure, Paulides read it 3 times before accepting that the equipment had not made an error. It had not made an error. The result had been confirmed. 96%. Paulides sat with that number the way you sit with something when you understand that the moment you act on it, it becomes real in a way it was not before you moved. He had been building toward this for 6 years. He had the physical evidence, he had the chain of custody. He had the independent laboratory confirmations. He had the burial that placed this population in those mountains 340 years ago. He had the trail camera footage of 3 living individuals in British Columbia from 5 months earlier. And now he had the number that told him what they actually were, measured against the human genetic baseline with a precision that left no interpretive room. He understood what it meant for the case. He understood what it meant for the field. And he understood what it meant for the other part of the record. David Paulides released his formal response to the accumulated evidence in the spring of 2026. When asked what his conclusion was after 6 years of systematic collection, he said 2 things. The first was that the physical evidence, 347 hair samples, 89 scat samples, 234 footprint casts, 47 handprint casts, 12 blood samples, tooth fragments, and skeletal remains, all processed by independent laboratories under consistent chain of custody protocols, all returning the same genetic and anatomical profile, was sufficient to confirm a specific biological claim. An unknown primate species inhabited the wilderness areas of North America. It had been there continuously for at least 340 years. It demonstrated tool use, territorial marking, nesting construction, family group dynamics, and burial of its dead. Its genetic profile showed 96% similarity to modern humans. It had never been formally described by science because science had never looked in the right places with the right tools. The second thing was not about science. There were 14 open missing persons cases in Paulides' files from drainages where his evidence collection had been most concentrated. 14 people who had entered remote wilderness areas within the documented range of this species and had not come back. He was not prepared to draw a direct causal connection between those disappearances and the presence of a species whose genetic makeup placed it closer to modern humans than any other known living primate. He was not going to make that claim. What he was prepared to say was this: for years, the investigators working those 14 cases had been operating without a critical piece of information. They had been searching for explanations within a framework that did not account for what the drainages actually contained. The evidence was now in the record. The 96% figure was in the record. The burial site, 340 years old, deliberate in the same mountains where the hair samples and the territorial markers and the trail camera footage were concentrated, was in the record. The framework had changed, and there was one more case. The hiker whose disappearance had led Paulides to the March 6, 2026 sample, the fresh hair on the Douglas fir at 8.5 feet, recovered 11 days after last contact in a drainage Paulides had visited 3 times before for other disappearances. That case was still open. The search was still running. The official search effort had found nothing.